Moving countries can be one of the most exciting and most challenging things you'll ever do. And we're here to take one big worry off your plate: your taxes. At Expat Taxes, we understand the complexities of Irish tax from your perspective as an expat and tailor our advice to your needs. With decades of expertise, our team at Expat Taxes will help you navigate tax residency, cross-border taxation, reliefs and returns, and will work with your country's tax advisor to make sure your taxes are sorted. Whether you're an individual or a corporation coming from Australia, the United States, the UK, or anywhere in the world, we want to help you. So visit us at expattaxes.ie to book a consultation today, and let's make moving to Ireland easier together.
Welcome to Tax Bites for Expats, the top tax tips you want to know as an expat. The podcast is here to help answer the common queries and concerns expats have when moving to or from Ireland. Complex taxes explained simply. We'll focus on the Irish and international tax issues to be aware of to ensure you save time, money, and stress.
Hi everyone, hope you're well. Welcome to today's episode. We're thrilled today to have an immigration expert from Ireland Relocations, Tom Ryan, joining us. Tom brings nearly 30 years of experience in immigration law, having worked with a major Scottish law firm and a national NGO before returning to Ireland in 2004 to address the growing need he saw for expert immigration services. And Ireland Relocations, they now offer unparalleled expertise in navigating Ireland's immigration system. So we're going to dive into two key areas today, the first being retirement to Ireland and the second being family migration. These are areas we think are relevant for our listeners. So we'll cover how the Irish immigration system works, the assessment criteria for applications, and tips for our listeners to enhance their chances of success if they are applying to relocate to Ireland. I'll introduce Tom in a second, but I'd like to kick off by saying that Ireland Relocations have very kindly made a special offer for our listeners. Anybody listening to this episode can enjoy a complimentary 30-minute consultation if they mention this podcast, and they can visit ireland-relocations.com. More info in the show notes. But without further ado, Tom, very welcome to Tax Bites for Expats. Thank you very much for coming on to talk to us.
Not at all. Thank you indeed for the invitation.
It's great to have you on. So maybe I gave you a little bit of an introduction there. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this space.
Oh, yeah. It's a long time ago now, I guess. Formerly, I was an academic. I was working in Edinburgh. And I ended up working with a lot of non-European Union nationals, I suppose. People would be coming in from the Gulf states, Iraq, Iran, to study. I spent a lot of time with them at the time as a teacher. But increasingly, I was also doing visa work because education in the UK was big business in the 90s. And I had to make a decision at some point in my career as to whether to remain teaching or move into more administrative spaces. So in the end, to cut a long story short, I ended up working with an NGO in asylum and human rights law for a number of years, and then a law firm in the same capacity before coming to Ireland in 2004, or coming back to Ireland since I'm from here originally. Ireland was a very empty space, I suppose, from the point of view of immigration providers in the early noughties. It was a highly developed industry within the UK. I mean, in Scotland, where I was, we're looking at maybe 150, 200 suppliers, and in Ireland, for a population of 4.5 million, that's not a lot of folk doing the business.
It's not a lot.
So, I mean, obviously, since, I suppose, Brexit, most particularly, we've seen a lot of people coming into the market space. Many UK law firms have rebadged as Irish law firms in order to retain access to the European Union markets, and they've brought with them expertise in relation to immigration service provision, which I recognise as, partly of my own background and training, because it's where I was formed originally in Edinburgh.
I suppose one question I have for anybody listening, what would you describe as an immigration system and how it works, particularly in an Irish context?
Immigration systems are systems of rules that a state would set up, either on its own or in concert with neighbouring countries. And it's used effectively to regulate border territory, aiming to protect its citizens, but also to protect those who wish to enter Ireland. It's a two-way process in that regard. In Irish terms, the immigration system works on a tripartite system, if you like. There is an employment permit system that's regulated by the Department of Enterprise. Then following that, if you require a visa, that's worked up through the Department of Justice. And following arrival in Ireland, you need to register your residence with the immigration authorities, either in Dublin or in the divisional headquarters, the Gardaí, in the area where you're living in the state. That whole process, since I've arrived back 20 years ago, has become far more systemised, concentrated and brought onto digital platforms, where beforehand it was very much a paper-driven exercise. The Irish system, in that respect, is very, very broad because it's addressing evolving needs of the state to address labour shortages, but also to address emerging family needs as populations move around. So it's become a complex business, immigration. Very difficult to summarise. When I was being asked to prepare for this podcast, I had to think, okay, how and where do I apply the razor on this one? Because there is just so many ifs and buts that need to be considered when you're looking at trying to describe what the process is. So we thought, okay, we're just going to have to take a hatchet and just cut out stuff like work permits and such like just now, because I could be here till 9:00 tonight. We're just not going to get away. So here we are. I thought we'd concentrate on these two areas because they possibly match what your listeners' profiles might be. More private individuals who are thinking about personal migration rather than corporate-driven migration, which is handled, in a different way.
I think you're spot on. I think a lot of our listeners are planning a move, often independent of their work situation. They might be retired. Maybe if we start with that cohort, maybe we start with the kind of people planning to retire in Ireland, what options broadly, and I completely appreciate what you said about it being a massive area, succinctly or as best as possible. How would you summarise that?
I'll do my best. Okay, well, I suppose what we do is we split the cohort into two, for starters. If you're Irish or a European Union or an EEA national, if you're a UK national, a Swiss national, there is no immigration criteria associated with retirement. You can retire here without necessarily considering the Department of Justice in your planning. I'm going to abbreviate those nationalities because I can't constantly repeat those people all the time. So I'm going to say Irish EU whenever I say anybody who's a non-European Union national. And I'm either going to say Irish EU or non-Irish EU in this regard, just so that we don't have to sort of constantly repeat that.
Constantly define ourselves.
Yeah, it is. It's a long one to have to repeat. So that's the abbreviation as we work forward in this. So there are two cohorts. There's effectively the Irish EU and the non-Irish EU. Those who are in the first don't have to consider an immigration dimension to their decision. Those in the second obviously do. And the Department of Justice has set up a distinct application route to cover this particular cohort of individuals in recent years. Prior to that, it was a paper-driven exercise. I remember going into the department with candidates for an application to do a retirement visa for Ireland. And we literally had to go in and stand in front of an immigration officer, and I had them previously bring everything, all their financial documentation. And we stood and we leafed through it in front of the immigration officer and effectively got the stamps that we needed to get. There was a conversation done in a kind of an informal manner, but there's a distinct application form now that you would use to deal with it. So dealing with Irish EU applications, you go through a system of pre-clearance within the Department of Justice, which is a process whereby you prepare an application on a standard form and it gets submitted to the department before you travel to Ireland. So you need to have this done as part of your planning, really. And immigration, people ought to give this process time in terms of planning a move to Ireland in immigration terms. The process currently takes 4 months to process through the Department of Justice. So give it time, plan it in with that. If you're a non-visa required national, once you have been issued that letter, you would require to apply for a visa through the embassy where you're living. So, for instance, if you're living in India, for instance, you then require to apply through the Irish Visa Office in New Delhi to get the visa in order to actually travel to Ireland. If you are non-visa required, let's say, for instance, you're a US citizen, once you've been issued the letter through that pre-clearance process, you would be able to travel to Ireland and present the letter to an immigration officer at the desk at Dublin Airport. They would stamp you in for 90 days with the instruction that you get yourself registered in the country.
And sorry, Tom, what's that stamp called? The one that you referenced?
Well, effectively, it's a 90-day stamp you get. Now, what you're aiming to get from the Department of Justice is known as a stamp zero. There are a range of stamps in Ireland covering various categories of activity. The most popular ones, or the most frequently referenced ones in our work, would be stamps 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those 4 out of possibly 6 stamps. And they define particular forms of activity that you're allowed to engage with in the country. Stamp 0, perhaps the clues in the name, does not allow you any form of economic activity whatsoever. So you are bringing your resources with you if you're retiring to Ireland. Now, what you do on arriving in Ireland is you send your passport to the Department of Justice. They will stamp in your passport and then instruct you to register your residence with, in effect, the Garda National Immigration Bureau, be it in Dublin and Burkey at the Department of Justice, or be it in one of the divisional headquarters at the Gardaí throughout the state. So depending on where you're living is where you'd actually do your registrations.
How long would your passport be gone for? I'm just thinking practically, if someone has to send their passport away, they're usually thinking, oh, how long is this going to be?
I think it'll be reasonably fast.
Okay.
I would anticipate if they're asking for the passport, for instance, you're looking at perhaps a week or two, to be honest with you. If there was any significant delay associated with the processing of a passport that they hold, you can ask for it temporarily back so that you could deal with whatever you needed to deal with. Or, they'd simply come in and have you in the office and they'd deal with you over the counter almost in order to facilitate the return of your passport. I've seen that done in countless types of situations where somebody needs to withdraw the passport. Increasingly, what they're doing is streamlining the process whereby they'll ask you to send certified copies of your passport to the Department of Justice. And they don't ask you to surrender your passport until they absolutely need to stamp it, sort of thing. Or they don't need to stamp it at all because increasingly they're moving a lot of this onto digital platforms anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the registration, once you have been through the process of applying for pre-clearance, getting your visa if necessary, travelling into Ireland, getting your passport stamped by the Department of Justice with this retirement conditions, you can then get yourself registered and get what's known as an Irish residence permit, an IRP card,
Mm-hmm.
to the credit card sized card, which is a chip in it and your photograph on it and your registration number. And that's you good to go for 12 months. However, what we would encourage people to do is to keep this relationship with the Department of Justice as a live consideration in your mind, because you're going to have to renew that on the 12-month anniversary. And again, you're looking at a 4-month processing thing. So, 6 months in, you start thinking about getting your paperwork organised again in relation to the renewal of a Stamp Zero.
And just to kind of my lack of understanding, so does that person, can they rely on the Irish healthcare system in that year? Do they have entitlement to any benefits, or do they need to come with foreign health insurance?
They need to come pretty much with everything. I'll let you know what the criteria are associated with this. You see, you do need to have a reasonably hefty amount of resources behind you in order to retire to Ireland. You are going to need health insurance up to VHI level D. You're going to need to prepare health declarations because the department, in context of anybody over a certain age coming to Ireland, they are deeply conscious of the potential draw that there may be on public resources for somebody who may have health difficulties in the longer run. So they do look at these questions empathetically to an extent, but also they have to make the decisions in terms of pounds, shillings and pence, really. So they will be looking at the level of resource requirement that might be associated with somebody present in Ireland. They'll need to have an annual income. An individual will need to have an income of up 50,000 euros net of annual expenses per year. For a couple, that doubles. So, they will need to be thinking about those kind of figures in terms of retiring here. They also need to have access to a lump sum of 320,000 approximately. They benchmark that roughly on the price of a house in Ireland. And that's what it's currently being assessed at. I've had a look through various industries with suppliers to see what kind of figures people are coming up with. But you'd want to have a robust average figure of that amount in your account to demonstrate that you have sufficient financial resources on an ongoing basis to cope with any unforeseen major expenses or circumstances that might apply. You need, in the process of applying and renewing, you need to verify your finances by way of a financial report that's certified by an accountancy firm in Ireland. That will need to demonstrate your projected outgoings and expense patterns on a monthly basis. So it's not straightforward in the sense that you do need to be on top of the detail when you're doing this type of application.
I'm just thinking about some of our clients and the fact pattern they might have. Is it rigid that you have 50,000 euros worth of income if you were cash rich to the point that you didn't have an income but you had lots of money?
Yeah.
Does that rule you out?
No. To be honest, we're in the business of looking at how people can do this, So, for instance, if somebody has a series of investments that can actually guarantee certain types of income on a monthly basis, and they've got investments that provide particular returns that can be averaged out, it can be put together. I mean, you're looking at combinations of pensions and private income sources, maybe rental incomes. These all need to be consolidated to see how the income pattern looks. And an accountant needs to say, yeah, this is a financially robust proposal. You're not going to be reliant on a salary. So you're looking at what private income sources you have. So I would be inclined to be flexible in terms of what's counted in, but it needs to be fairly solid, if you know what I mean. At least for the 12 months that you're here, and it'll need to be sustained for any subsequent periods that you're here. So, like I said, it's a live issue. Keep the line open with your accountancy firm and keep these things, pretty much on your in tray whilst you're here. So, in a sense, I suppose, given the level of attention that you're giving to your finances, you're perhaps more semi-retired than retired. But there you go. That's the way it works in Ireland at the moment.
The other question I was going to ask, because it comes up quite frequently, would be the scenario you've mentioned alludes to, let's say it's a couple, both require visas. Does what you've said, I would expect what you've said, look slightly different if you have a returning Irish person who's married, for example, a US person? So maybe if you can tell us how that process looks. I think the process you've explained is where, for example, a married couple, neither of them have the right to live and work in Ireland.
Yes, I mean, you're getting involved in more family migration territory when you're looking at that. An Irish person obviously has an entitlement to reside in Ireland. If they're bringing a spouse, if they're retired, the likelihood is they're bringing the spouse alone. I think it's a question then of looking what the income pattern would be that will be more associated with visa applications for this type of application. And the government policy that was published in 2016 and has been updated on an ad hoc basis since talks about if you're bringing in elderly parents, you're potentially bringing in an income of about 60,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of mapping that onto this particular scenario because what we would want to do is to benchmark an application in a robust fashion, looking at how they treat other similar situations, if you like. So bringing in an elderly person who's a parent of an applicant or a spouse, that's the sort of figure you'd be benchmarking for a sort of a dependent person who may be post-retirement age. I would be looking at that kind of income level. They would go through potentially either a visa application if they were visa required. So if you're bringing somebody, let's say for the sake of argument, from China or India as a spouse, retired, you go through the visa process. And that would be kind of the income territory we're looking at there. If you are non-visa required and married, you would probably be going through just coming in, presenting to Ireland, and then going to register with the Department of Justice in Dublin.
And do you go on to a different stamp then?
Yeah, you would go on to, notionally, if you're a spouse of an Irish citizen, you go on to stamp 4.
Right.
Which is a stamp that allows you to work. I mean, you're not coming in as a retiree, you're coming in as the trailing spouse of an Irish national or a European Union national for that measure too. So there you're looking at, they're going to be coming in and accruing the rights, largely speak, that are associated with the citizen. It becomes slightly more complicated in European terms because you're using potentially European Union regulations, which are quite liberal in many respects, which don't actually specify income levels for a particular family. But again, you want to be on top of that detail really when you're preparing an application, because visa officer wants to have any questions answered in the application rather than having to ask them themselves. I always try to do that. We try and stress test applications before they go anywhere near a decision maker. So we would be asking about income and establishing that it can be securely fixed at a viable level when they're coming to Ireland.
So how or what would you recommend maximizes the success for an application in any of these situations, I suppose, generally speaking?
What we would do is suggest that you speak to an expert. To be honest, don't try and do it yourself. I would honestly suggest that because it's a question of cross-referring the regulations to see how the regulations talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, if you refer simply to the family reunification policy, that's 8 years old. Figures in it aren't up to date, so you need to be cross-referring with what other activities going on within the immigration system to see where benchmarks truly sit at this stage. So speak to an expert, delegate the running of a case to an expert, such as ourselves or whoever you might want to use. You need to identify the correct road or route that you're going through. and that you do meet the requirements associated with that route, and particularly in the area of finance, and that the right documentation is in place and to the required standard as well. So, for instance, marriage certificates, do they require apostilles or not? Do they require certified translation or not? If you're bringing dependent family in, for instance, who might be adopted children under a certain age, you certainly need to be talking about adoption papers, again, certified, possibly bearing an apostille. And indeed, court documents for situations of divorce where there might be a blended family situation coming to Ireland. And there you're going to be looking at, just covering all the angles with the necessary papers, thinking about it in the round. What is an immigration officer going to ask? What sort of comfort can you give them in terms of information and documentation? So anybody who's done this type of application will kind of try and keep ahead of the wave like a surfer on this and just have the right questions to ask while we're stress testing and setting the application up. I always talk about giving an application anxious scrutiny in the first sort of hour or so of receiving instructions and see how it works. And if it's a goer, fine, you're confident, because you don't want to be visiting situations maybe a week in and realizing that, maybe we ought to have asked a few other questions about this one.
It gets stressful when you're having to ask those questions at the tail end of a process,
Oh,
definitely.
yeah.
And perhaps this is not necessarily an area you guys focus on, but I suppose generally speaking, in the cases we've spoken about, is there a defined progression to apply for an Irish passport, or is that contingent on the type of stamp and visa that an individual might have?
It would be, yeah. Stamp zero is inherently a temporary stamp. The application process has temporary in its title. So that stamp, the stamp zero, doesn't allow progression. You'll be on that one for as long as you remain in Ireland. The progressions are associated largely with either workers who come to Ireland on stamp ones, or students who migrate into the workforce can start accumulating reckonable residence for citizenship applications once they migrate onto either what's known as a 1G stamp, or move themselves onto a 1 stamp, which is associated with a work permit. And also family-related migration. There's progression associated with those types, in the sense that, let's say, a spouse who might formerly have been on what's known as a stamp 3, which is a spousal dependent stamp, really, which didn't allow for very much else in terms of activity other than being a trailing spouse. But they could progress to what's known as a stamp 4 ultimately, which is what most workers are looking for, which allows you to work and reside in Ireland without the need for a work permit. Once you've accumulated 60 months on qualifying residence in Ireland, you would be able to apply for an Irish citizenship certificate and thereafter a passport. There are a few catches associated with the process in that it's highly detailed, because you're expected to produce your bills and your receipts for 6 years or for 5 years for any of the qualifying period that you've been here. And also you need to avoid any breaks in your residence in Ireland in terms of losing status by virtue of changing from one stamp to another. You might drop out of status for even a few weeks. That residence doesn't get counted. So it's very, very important to keep yourself what I refer to as street legal, whereby you keep the stamp current and you renew it in time so that you don't drop out of status even for a short period of time.
So I just want to think about if somebody hasn't done that and something expires, is that a problem? I assume yes.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, like a lot of situations, the Irish immigration system is carrying a lot of load, if you know what I mean. I counted up the number of visa applications that went through the Irish visa office in Delhi there last week, just out of curiosity to see what the numbers were. But we do a lot of work with that area. And 47,000 applications went through the visa office in Delhi between January and last week, of which I think maybe 7.5% were refused. So the rest of them have valid visas, so they can travel. I would suspect the vast majority of these are Indian students going into master's programs, or Indian engineers going into the high-tech industries here. So, I tend to view it as a positive for the Irish economy, because the skills these guys have are incredible. They are amazing. They are quite literally rocket scientists, a lot of these guys. So your immigration system is fairly busy, if that's one jurisdiction's levels of business as things currently stand. And what that tends to do is it tends to overload offices with work. So processing times spin out in 4 months. In my mind, it's a long period of time. If you're applying for a European Union residence card, for instance, as the spouse of an Irish or an EU citizen coming back to Ireland from another European country, you're looking at a process ultimately that lasts 12 months before the application process completes in its entirety. So the department has had to put in a lot of interim measures to cope with this situation. If a person comes into the country and their card expires, they will have to have applied for a replacement card before the expiry date on the card. Now, if the card doesn't issue until after that expiry date, the Department of Justice gives a discretionary allowance whereby you can remain on your conditions surrounding the grant of the first card until your second card issues. So they actually don't interfere with your situation because they realise that you've fallen out of status through no fault of your own. And they will allow that, and that's a product of the COVID experience. They will allow that to run on for 8 weeks from the expiry date of your card. So it gives them 2 months to issue you the card. So you're secure in an immigration sense in Ireland if you do not renew your card until after your expiry date. And that may happen. You will fall out of status, but the department, it implies in its remarks that it'll straighten you out when you apply for a new card if you have the necessary supporting documentation to allow you to continue your registration. In most cases, that is when a work permit issues. But if there's a delay to a work permit issuing, technically you can't apply for your new card until you've got your new work permit. So you can fall out of status. But again, the Department of Enterprise and the Department of Justice take a slightly flexible attitude in relation to this, in the sense that they will allow you a discretionary period for the process to work through so that you can get your documentation. If there's evidence that you've made every effort to secure your documentation in time, and you won't necessarily be penalised by an overly long processing period as a result of that. That is something that we've seen quite a lot in, I suppose, post-COVID really, where processing times were disrupted by lack of manpower and such like.
I think that was a common theme across many government departments. There's so much to what you said, and I think much of it is of massive interest to a lot of the people who are listening. They either are planning a move, independent of any family member being Irish, or have, a spouse or family member coming with them. Just going back to what you said about, the early 90s or the early 2000s were a very different time in Ireland. And I know even, our generation has taken advantage of immigration into other countries. It's really interesting to hear how it works here. And I think as well, as EU nationals, we don't think of Ireland as a place that has immigration obligations, but of course it does. It's just that us Irish people, we don't come across it. So thank you so much for that explanation. And I think as well, anybody listening is going to be very keen to look at the website Ireland-relocations.com. The link will be in the show notes. And just for a bit more information, Ireland Relocations offers a full range of relocation services, including home searches, school searches, and settling in services. I know you work with both business, corporate clients and private clients, Tom, so that'll be of interest to anybody listening. Anybody listening can refer to the website or reach out directly to Gráinne Convery at gráinne.convery@conangroup.ie. Again, we'll drop that into the show notes. Tom, thank you so much for your time and for your detailed explanations. I feel much more enlightened about how it all works. It's definitely a complicated process. Thank you.
No problem at all. Pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Tax Bites for Expats. Please do leave a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcast. And as always, remember to take professional tax advice specific to your personal circumstances before acting or refraining from action in connection with the matters dealt with in this series. The material in this podcast is intended to give general guidance only.